Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my 5 bold predictions for the 25-26 San Jose Sharks. And as opposed to previous seasons, I am doubling down on just how bold these predictions are going to end up. I'm not going to go so crazy and say that the Sharks are going to win the Stanley Cup this season or anything like that, but these are events that theoretically none of the 5 of them could actually end up happening. They are relatively far out there, but are within the realm of possibility and do have some logic behind why I am saying them. So to start off at the top of this list, number 1, I say that John Klingberg will score at a 60-point pace during this upcoming season with the San Jose Sharks. Now, the reason why I specify it's going to be a 60-point pace is that if he is actually doing this well, he'll probably end up getting traded at the deadline, and so will not finish out the season with the Sharks. But at the time of such a trade occurring, I think that if you were to run the math, he would have about a 60-point season over a full 82 games. Now, the reason that I'm saying this is that Klingberg has been a very successful offensive defenseman in the past. It hasn't been the case in these last couple of years due to injuries, but it seems as though he is coming into this season relatively healthy. He was able to survive a grueling set of playoff series last year with the Edmonton Oilers, including the final round against a very tough team in the Florida Panthers. And so now, with multiple months off here in this off season, I am hoping that Klingberg will be able to come in here with that fresh slate and be able to do well, and the Sharks will be putting him into a position for this. I imagine he's going to get prime offensive zone opportunities. I imagine he's going to find himself on the top power play unit for the San Jose Sharks, and this is going to be an opportunity for him to really inflate his scoring totals. And the reason I am somewhat confident about this is that if you go back to last season, this is a similar position as to what Jake Wallman was put into, and by the time he got traded to the Edmonton Oilers, he actually had about a 52-point pace. And so I don't think it is that crazy to think that Klingberg could hit a little bit above that, especially when you consider the fact that the San Jose Sharks were the lowest scoring team in the NHL this past season, and I don't expect that to actually repeat itself this year. I wouldn't be that surprised if the Sharks were able to improve by maybe like 20, 25, perhaps even up to 30 goals, which would put them more so close to the middle of the pack in terms of NHL scoring, with the improvements that are going to be made offensively for this team, especially on the blue line with a player like Klingberg. And even though Wallman did have that 52-point pace, I wouldn't even say that Wallman was necessarily that great of an offensive defenseman. He was solid at clearing out of the zone, but once he was actually in the offensive zone, he didn't quite have that creativity to really be able to set up strong plays, and that is something that I am expecting at least a little bit more from when it comes to John Klingberg. And so the general level of increased offense, plus the fact that maybe he will be a little bit better suited for this particular role, I think he could hit that 60-point pace mark. The second one on this list is that Mario Ferraro will be traded by New Year's Eve. So before January rolls around in this upcoming season, I do think Ferraro will be off the San Jose Sharks. Now, the idea of the Sharks trading Ferraro at some point during this next season isn't actually all that bold. He is on an expiring contract. He does still have some level of value around the NHL. There are teams that are going to be interested in a player like Ferraro, who is incredibly hardworking, constantly leads the team in terms of hits and blocks, a type of player who is very much built for a playoff series. I imagine teams will be very willing to try and pick him up. Maybe the price won't be so significantly high as it has been for the San Jose Sharks in these past couple of seasons. They'll want to try to recoup some value, just as they did with Mikael Granlund in this previous year. So him actually getting traded by the deadline is probably a relatively likely scenario to occur, but I do think it actually happens earlier on. I was actually even going to go so far as to say that this trade could occur before the season even starts, but now that we are getting close to mid-August, we're only about a month away until things really begin to open up here in the NHL. I'm not quite sure if that's going to occur, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens early on in the season. This is for a few reasons. Right now, the Sharks do have a significant logjam on defense. They've got 9 players there. There's probably going to have to be one of them at the very least who gets put onto waivers, because I suspect that the Sharks will want to run not 9 defensemen and have that extra 13th forward. So whether that's Vinny DeHarnay or Jack Thompson who get put on waivers, I'm not entirely sure. But having that many defensemen isn't exactly an optimal situation. And on top of that, I think the beginning of the year is really going to be a chance for the Sharks to kind of feel out what they have, in particular when it comes to their young defensemen, Shakir Mukhamadullin, as well as Sam Dickinson, who is expected to be sticking in the NHL with the San Jose Sharks. If Mukhamadullin does do as well as I am expecting, as you might see with my third bold prediction here, as well as Sam Dickinson being able to handle a semi-constant role in the NHL, Ferraro becomes a good bit more expendable compared to what he might have been in the past couple of seasons. And so I do believe that that trade will happen sooner rather than later, maybe around the time as when Mackenzie Blackwood was traded this past season, and that is what I think will occur. On the third bold prediction now, I say that Shakir Mukhamadullin will be the Sharks' best defenseman by the end of the season. Now, this is somewhat of a misleading prediction because I believe that by the time the season does end, the Sharks will no longer have Ferraro and they'll no longer have John Klingberg, and so that is a significantly reduced level of competition that Mukhamadullin will have to face up against. But the one player who likely will remain with the Sharks for the entire year that could be competitive for this top spot is Dmitry Orlov. I expect that he's going to be able to come in and play rather well for the Sharks, but I still have this worry in the back of my mind that Orlov might not end up being as good as he has been in the past. Not only is age a factor, but it just feels as though a player who has been on such competitive teams for so many years in a row and is now coming to a team that isn't really expected to do much damage at all in the NHL standings, that we might end up seeing a drop-off in terms of his performance. So that is as much of an aspect of this, as much as I also believe Mukhamadullin is going to see a huge jump up and strides being made in his game. He showed a good amount of confidence and just the strong attitude to be able to be a solid defenseman in the NHL near the end of last season, despite all of the factors surrounding the Sharks, all the trades that they made, and how much of a weaker team they were over the final couple of months of the season. Mukhamadullin was a rare standout player for them, and as long as the injury that he sustained late in the season against Anaheim doesn't truly affect things happening here in this offseason, and he's able to come in ready to go and healthy for this upcoming season, I do believe he will find himself arguably as the Sharks' top defenseman. I say arguably because it's very possible that Warsofsky will default to Dmitry Orlov more often than not, just because he is more of that veteran player. But I do think that by the end of the season, you will absolutely be able to say that Mukhamadullin is the Sharks' #1 player there. It is perhaps due to a lack of better options. Again, I'm saying that really only Orlov is going to compete for that title just in that immediate moment, but still, I do think he will rise to the top. When it comes to the fourth bold prediction, we have that William Eklund will be a point-per-game player this season. And this is a pretty crazy one. He scored 58 points this past season in 77 games, so he was somewhat close, but still a decent way away from actually being that 82-point player. But I do also believe that Eklund faced a lot of adversity this past season that kind of held him back a little bit. The first of which is that this was a season that by the end of it, he would be up for an extension, and as we know, sometimes these types of contract years, it wasn't fully a contract year, but because that extension was in the works, perhaps it affected his mentality throughout the season. Sometimes this can hold a player back, but more so there were two big moments that I think really affected Eklund this year. The first of which was actually the one that came later in the season, which is when Fabian Zetterlund was traded at the deadline. This was Eklund's best friend on the team. That was definitely tough to deal with, especially at a point with just about a month or so left in the season where the Sharks were very clearly going to finish right at the bottom of the standings. For Eklund to then lose that type of player there and that type of friend, not an easy situation to finish out the season. But the one that then came earlier than that was actually in December when William Eklund was snubbed for a position on the Swedish team for the Four Nations tournament. And as we have seen throughout the last couple of years here, William Eklund does seem to have a lot of Swedish pride. He really wants to be able to represent his team on the international stage, but at multiple different moments of his career, he has actually been unable to do so. If you go back all the way to the 2022 World Juniors that he was playing at, it ended up getting canceled due to the COVID situation. When they reopened it up back late into August to try to redo it during that summer, Eklund did not want to participate to try and prepare for the NHL season, so he really didn't get a World Juniors opportunity. Then, as I mentioned, he got snubbed for the Four Nations this season. He was then supposed to compete with Team Sweden at the World Championships just a few months ago. ago, but he had that really scary and unfortunate wrist injury that kept him out for the majority of that tournament. And so he has yet to really be able to step into that limelight here for his international team. But as we go into this next season, the big thing now is the Olympics, and this is the biggest possible international stage that exists. Obviously, players dream growing up that they're going to be able to lift the Stanley Cup, but another big deal is being able to win that Olympic gold medal. NHL players have not had the opportunity to do this for 12 years since 2014, and it is finally opening up again here in 2026, and Eklund has a very good shot at that. And so going into this next season, there is going to be a ton of motivation, in particular over the first couple of months, to do well, to not end up being snubbed yet again. I think he's got a very good shot, because in particular this past season, the Four Nations tournament, a couple of players that made it above him, Victor Arvidsson and Gustav Nyquist, they were really odd inclusions at the time, and in hindsight look even worse than that. Nyquist just signed, I believe, a one-year contract, just over $3 million with the Winnipeg Jets, doesn't exactly scream star player, and then Victor Arvidsson was traded from the Oilers to the Boston Bruins for a 5th-round pick. Neither of these two players are valued all that highly. Meanwhile, Eklund just got a $5.6 million bridge extension. He should definitely be in line for that inclusion as long as he does well, and I think he's going to try his absolute best to get to that point. And then in the months leading up to the Olympics, I imagine that motivation level stays pretty high to really try and gear up for it. And so I'm expecting a big season from William Eklund. Not to mention, earlier on, I had said that I expect the Sharks to also be scoring more goals as a whole this season with the help that they're getting on the blue line and the improvements from players like Celebrini and Smith. And considering Eklund will be either with Celebrini or Smith for the entirety of this season on a first or a second line, the scoring opportunities will definitely be there. And I think he could flirt with that 82-point mark. Probably not all that much higher than that, but he'll be at around that level. Perhaps this is a bit too high on him, and maybe he falls closer to like 65 to 70 points, but I do think that motivation will absolutely be there. The final prediction on this list is that Michael Misa will be a Calder finalist. Now, last year, I had a bold prediction that Macklin Celebrini would be a Calder finalist, and people thought that that wasn't all that bold, and indeed, Celebrini did end up making that. He was only 3rd, but it was still a finalist position. But with Michael Misa, this is a much lower likelihood situation. Celebrini was an extremely hyped up 1st overall pick. Misa, 2nd overall pick, still very, very good, but we're still even questioning whether or not he'll be in the NHL this season. But this prediction is twofold. Not only is it having that Misa will be a Calder finalist, but that also assumes that he will be spending not just a portion of the season in the NHL, but the entirety of it. So I don't have him going to the NCAA. Now that we're getting close to mid-August, it just seems very unlikely that that situation occurs. And I don't think at any point he's going to actually end up getting sent down to the OHL to go back and play with Saginaw. The reason for that is that if you go back to this past season with Will Smith, for instance, he struggled quite significantly at times through October and November at the beginning of the season, and not once was he actually sent down. And he really only had to go across the hall to be sent down to the San Jose Barracuda, and could have easily been called back up at any point, and yet the Sharks refused to do that despite his struggles. So for Michael Misa, the fact that they would have to send him back to the OHL where they wouldn't be able to call him back up until the season ends, it just seems extremely unlikely that that would happen. So I suspect Misa, as long as he gets to that NHL point, which I am predicting will happen, he'll maintain that spot from game 81 to game 82. Now, the step from actually making it to the NHL and then being a Calder finalist is very, very difficult, but it is one that I am predicting to happen. There were a couple other candidates here for the San Jose Sharks, because they will have a few big-name rookies making, not technically debuts for some of them, but will have their rookie seasons this year. Misa was one. There's also Sam Dickinson, as well as Yaroslav Askarov. But in the case of Askarov, I obviously considered both of these players, but for Askarov, we just saw Dustin Wolf be a Calder finalist as a goaltender this past season, but that was somewhat of a not necessarily unique situation, but it is rather rare that a goaltender finds themselves up here, because for goaltenders, your stats are kind of reliant on your own teams, and a lot of the time Calder finalists are on teams that aren't necessarily going to be in the playoffs, but the reason that Wolf was there is that by a combination of some pretty decent defense from Calgary as well as some great play from Dustin Wolf, he was able to bring Calgary to within just a couple of points of a playoff spot. But even if Askarov does put up similar stats to Dustin Wolf, because I think the Sharks will have a much weaker defense than Calgary did this past season, I can't imagine that they'll be at that 95-point mark, maybe closer to somewhere like 75-80, and that is already being very, very generous with San Jose, at which point I don't really see Askarov managing to be a top 3 candidate. And then when it comes to Sam Dickinson, it just feels as though there are a few too many defensemen that are likely to be above him in this type of race. In particular, his fellow draft year players in Ziv Buyam and Zane Parik, who have already gotten head starts in the NHL this past season. Parik played a couple games with Calgary. We saw Ziv Buyam actually get a few playoff games with the Minnesota Wild. And then on top of that, you also have the fact that Dickinson is likely going to be eased more so into the NHL situation here this season for the Sharks, being like a third pairing defenseman, at times being a healthy scratch, while guys like Ziv Buyam in particular with Minnesota is probably going to be put in the spotlight. We already saw, despite his struggles, honestly, in the few games he got in that first round against the Vegas Golden Knights with Minnesota, he was still placed on their top power play unit. He was still on the ice when Minnesota was trying to close in and tie a game in the dying minutes with the goaltender pulled. So they were very much relying on him for some offense. That is likely to carry into this next season, so it's hard to imagine that Dickinson will be able to eclipse one of those performances. And then of course you also have Nikishin from Carolina, who is a rookie by technical standards here in the NHL, by the definition of it, but considering he spent multiple years playing in a men's league, a competitive league there in the KHL, he does have a pretty significant advantage being multiple years older than Sam Dickinson, kind of like what, Kaprizov and Panarin had when they came into the NHL a few years ago, respectively. When it comes to the forward side, however, Misa, I do think, has a little bit more of a chance, because while Dickinson is probably going to be eased into a role, Misa, at the very least, at the start, will probably find himself in a third-line position where he'll still be playing with some decent offensive players like Wenberg or Graf or Kurashev, these types of guys who can still help put up some points. And as long as Misa is able to find his footing rather quickly, which I do think can happen, it would not be that much of a surprise to see him actually get the bump up to a top 6 position. That could be over a guy like Colin Graf or Kurashev, whoever ends up being that player in that top 6. Those are not necessarily two players that are going to be difficult to bump out of that role. Even if necessarily one of the two is a slightly better option on paper, the fact is that Michael Misa does have that draft pedigree. This is a player who you expect to be a top line player for you within the next year or two. You want to put him into a position to succeed this season. And so finding himself on a line with Will Smith or with Macklin Celebrini, probably Celebrini more likely, just because of the more defensive game that he will bring, is not something that we might have to wait all that long to actually see. And if you get to play with guys like Celebrini, the point totals are definitely going to come with it. And so it wouldn't be that crazy to see a world where Misa is able to put up close to 45, 50 plus points. Will Smith, despite having struggled for the first 2, even 3 months of the season and having a lot of time spent with players like Barclay Goodrow and Luke Cunnin, was still able to end the year with 45 points. It is not that crazy to assume that Misa can match that and perhaps even eclipse it as well. It is going to be tough to actually get a Calder victory here for Misa this season. I would say that the probably favorite for that at this point is Ivan Demidov on the Montreal Canadiens, just based on what we had seen near the end of last season in the regular season for him, where he had some really impressive debuts. He struggled definitely in the playoffs against the Washington Capitals, but it is expected that in a much less tightly checked game that the regular season does bring in the NHL, that he'll be able to really flourish, especially with top power play minutes with the Montreal Canadiens that Misa might not get out of the gate. So a victory for the Calder is going to be difficult, but a finalist position is certainly possible, even if it is rather bold, as I am saying here. But that will do it for this video. As I said, it is certainly a possibility that none of these 5 actually ends up happening. They are a little bit more out there than I am usually going with, but it would certainly be exciting to see if they did occur. Class dismissed.